Now to today's event. No need to tell you much background about Edward Snowden and the event that we all remember when we discovered that this man was in our very own city. But we are delighted to have his lawyer, Mr. Robert Tibbo, who is still advising Edward Snowden as he is at the moment in Russia. We want, of course, to hear all about Edward Snowden. And I think Mr. Tibbo also wants to update us on the status of the very brave people who have helped the protection and then the departure of Edward Snowden in Hong Kong. And we'll actually have a chance to meet and ask a few questions to some of these refugees right after Mr. Tibbo's presentation. So without further ado, please welcome Robert Tibbo to speak to you.
Well, I want to thank the FCC for inviting me here today, and it's wonderful to see the number of people here today who are interested in Mr. Snowden and his case. So what I'll do is I'm going to go through a number of slides. I'm going to talk about what happened in 2013. There are still a lot of misconceptions about the circumstances of Mr. Snowden at that time. So the last time I met with Ed was in Moscow last summer, and this photo was taken at that time. All right, just a little bit of background, very briefly. I'm Canadian, and I'm originally from Montreal and Quebec, the original one country, two systems jurisdiction with a full and robust democracy. Hoping Hong Kong one day will have that, and, where you get the full transparency and accountability. I went to McGill and then later University of Auckland, and I spent most of my career in Asia Pacific, working in various countries. In terms of my law practice, at law school I had focused primarily on constitutional and administrative law, public law, and with my practice in Hong Kong, it's split between criminal work and doing work for asylum seekers and refugees. And I also have a corporate and commercial practice as well. Now, a little bit of background. Before 2010, there was no formal, no lawful screening system. Before 2004, there was no screening. Asylum seekers would come into Hong Kong. If they approached the Hong Kong government would not inform them that Hong Kong was a signatory to the UN Convention Against Torture. So most asylum seekers would go to the UNHCR, which has an office here in Hong Kong. In 2010, the High Court had compelled the Hong Kong government to implement a screening system for asylum seekers, which provided legal assistance. And there are a lot of problems in that system which remain today. A lack of cultural sensitivity, a lack of education of the lawyers, a lack of education of the immigration officers. Now, the reason why I'm saying this is because since 2009 or 2010, there's only been 72 asylum seekers who've been accepted out of more than 10,000 refugees or asylum seekers in Hong Kong. So it's effectively in a 0% acceptance rate. In 2012, and this is where my involvement with the asylum seeking community became very significant. My instructing solicitor, Jonathan Mann, and Jonathan is also Ed Snowden's lawyer, we found out that there were hundreds of asylum seekers locked up unlawfully at the Castle Peak Bay Detention Center, Immigration Center. So we went in pro bono, and we got dozens of people out. We secured their liberty. And there was a knock-on effect where literally hundreds of asylum seekers were released. And it was from that starting point that, my involvement in the asylum seeking community and refugees really started to expand. 10th of June 2013. Right. So I have to say I was exhausted at that point, and I received a call very early in the morning. Very early, and there was a request that the individual who was leaking data, documents that were confidential from the NSA, the CIA, had appeared on TV, had disclosed himself, and that was Ed Snowden, and that was the Glenn Greenwald interview that Laura Poitras filmed. And what he needed was legal advice. So I'm going to go through this crucial, pivotal period of time. When a client is distressed, your priority is to gain access to that person immediately, as fast as possible, because anything could happen between that initial contact and the time you meet your client. And there could be intervening events. Your client could be apprehended. Your client could be cornered by police officers, could be cornered by the press, and you don't want your client to talk. You want to give your client full legal advice and their options, legal options. Now, I'm going to go on to this subject about Snowden's status in Hong Kong at that time and during the whole time he was in Hong Kong.
Just walk out of there. You don't have to go back.
Okay.
Take whatever you want with you and just go with Mr. Mann. I will pick you. He knows where I'm going to pick you guys up, and then I'll bring you to the UNHCR.
Okay, that sounds good.
All right.
Thank you so much for helping.
Yeah,
with
he's
this, by the way.
quite worried about the next day, about the accommodation, or he's going to stay. Whether there's something private and they cannot be discovered by the police.
Don't worry about that now. Let's just get up to the UN.
Okay, I see. Okay, I will give you a call, hit up it before I restart, okay?
Okay, thank you.
All right. So there's not yet we don't have a car with such. No, I don't aware of where to dump you.
All right, so at this point, you can see Ed, you could see he's distressed, and you could see after the advice, that was myself speaking on the phone. Jonathan Mann, my instructor solicitor, is in the room, and they're leaving. So Ed was severely distressed at that time.
The president certainly does not welcome.
Ed made a decision of conscience. His mind was clear, intellectually, completely clear. He understood there'd be consequences. But as a human being, when you arrive at a point where you know you may lose your liberty or you may lose your life, tens of thousands of years of DNA built into you, is a flight or fight. Adrenaline is pumped into your system. So Ed was in to some degree, a distressed state emotionally at that time. So as a lawyer, you need to have access to your client, particularly when they're that vulnerable. So I'm going to go back to PowerPoint. Now, under Hong Kong law, Ed had a valid visa when he was in Hong Kong at that time. And he had a valid visa up to the time that he left Hong Kong on the 23rd of June, okay? He was never a fugitive from justice in Hong Kong because he had never broken any Hong Kong laws. The only way he could become a fugitive in Hong Kong, apart from breaking any Hong Kong law, is with a request by the US government under the Fugitive Offenders Ordinance. There's a treaty between the Hong Kong government and the United States government, and the US government was never able to send through an effective request. They had sent a request through on the 21st or 22nd, it was 22nd in Hong Kong of June, but it was defective. First and foremost, they didn't put the proper name, the correct name for Ed Snowden. They put Edward James Snowden. Ed's name is Edward Joseph Snowden. So from that point, it was a completely defective request. So my concern as a lawyer was making sure Ed was protected, that he had all the legal advice he he needed to make fully informed decisions. But the first thing was there was a risk, a real risk, in my mind, and also in Mr. Snowden's mind, that he could be abducted and extraordinarily renditioned from Hong Kong, because Hong Kong has that history. With the Sami al-Sadi case in 2004, the Hong Kong government detained Sami al-Sadi, his wife, and three or four kids at the Hong Kong airport for 2 weeks, and then put those individuals on a flight, a secret flight organized by the UK and US government to Libya, where the whole family was imprisoned and al-Sadi was tortured. Hong Kong has a history of renditions with the mainland Chinese authorities coming into the Hong Kong jurisdiction and taking people out. Most recently with the 5 booksellers in 2015, and this year with Xiao Jianhua, who was staying at a Canadian hotel, the Four Seasons, where he was abducted and taken across the border. So there was zero trust in the Hong Kong government. So the second thing is the UNHCR versus the Immigration Department. Okay, so the first priority was we had to get Mr. Snowden out of the hotel undetected, and we needed to get him to the UNHCR. We couldn't bring him to the torture claim screening assessment section, which is now called the removal assessment section, to have him raise an asylum claim with the Hong Kong government, because under Hong Kong law, an asylum seeker who arrives in Hong Kong is not allowed to raise an asylum claim until he breaks the law. So the Hong Kong government criminalizes asylum seekers by saying, okay, you say you've been tortured or persecuted in your home country, just overstay your visa, we'll arrest you, we'll charge you with overstaying. The current policy is we're not going to prosecute you and send you to prison now, we'll wait till your asylum claim's over. But for Mr. Snowden, he couldn't even apply because he couldn't qualify because he had a valid visa. The second thing is, even if Mr. Snowden overstayed his visa, the Hong Kong government ultimately is answerable to Beijing. So it was very clear to me that any disclosures to the Hong Kong government for their asylum screening system, there was a real risk, in my view, that that would be disclosed to Beijing, because Beijing has security interested in Mr. Snowden. Hong Kong has security interested in Mr. Snowden. So the only choice was the UNHCR, because the UNHCR is not Hong Kong jurisdiction, even though they have an office here. It's a separate jurisdiction that we could go to the UNHCR, but Mr. Snowden had to raise his hand and walk in. So as you heard on the phone, you saw in the video, I was on the phone, I'd been to the UNHCR, and it was a priority to get Mr. Snowden in there, undetected. Because if the media was following us, then certainly the Hong Kong government and other governments would be following. So raising an asylum claim through the Hong Kong government was not a legal option. Now, this criminalization of asylum seekers is in violation of Article 14 of the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights and Article 31 of the Refugee Convention, which is a non-penalization principle. So just to emphasize that. Now, I'll go into this later if I have time, but the priority for Mr. Snowden after raising his claim with the UNHCR was to put him underground. And that's what we did. But we had to consider where are we going to put Mr. Snowden where people wouldn't look. And for me, it was a common sense decision or advice to Mr. Snowden. Because he was an asylum seeker at that point, it was in his best interest to stay with the asylum seeking community. The asylum seeking community has been marginalized. They've been put into conditions of inhumane and degrading treatment by the Hong Kong government. They're not allowed to work. Their basic needs aren't met. If they work, it's 22 months prison after trial. If they do volunteer work, it's 22 months prison. This is a community where the adults aren't allowed to go to school. And they're a community that no one in Hong Kong looks at. They're ignored. They're Hong Kong's version of untouchables. So I calculated that Mr. Snowden staying with the asylum seekers, nobody would dare look. The second part of the strategy was to put Mr. Snowden in an area of Hong Kong that was densely populated, because again, people wouldn't expect Mr. Snowden to be located there. So it was a strategy to hide Mr. Snowden in plain sight. That was my advice. And the asylum seekers were living in very poor conditions. So in these buildings, I had to consider which of my asylum seekers' clients were in buildings where there were no elevators and no cameras. So then it was a matter of considering, okay, which families do I know and which families could we bring Mr. Snowden to, and ask them, would you be willing to take in a fellow asylum seeker? So we did that. And the other important factor is that the asylum seeking community has no support structure except amongst themselves and a few lawyers and a few NGOs. So I had known that the asylum seeking community it's very common for them to bring in other asylum seekers to support them when they arrive in Hong Kong or when they're in trouble. Okay. So when Jonathan Mann and I brought Mr. Snowden to these families, immediately they recognized that, oh, he's one of us. He's in a position where he's raised an asylum claim. In my view, his claim was based on persecution based on political opinion. Based on the Bradley or Chelsea Manning case, he certainly would be subjected to torture and cruel and inhuman degrading treatment or punishment if sent back to the US. So the asylum seekers said, come in, we'll take care of you. So I knew that Ed, because he was in an emotionally difficult situation at that time, would benefit greatly by being with people who understood his circumstances and who had empathy for him. And that turned out to be good advice, because Ed calmed down staying with these families, because they really provide a very caring, warm environment for him, and they wouldn't talk. They had all been in his situation in Sri Lanka and the Philippines. So during that period of time, Ed Snowden was able to make his decisions on what he was going to do, whether he was going to stay in Hong Kong or leave. And it was apparent to Ed in the end that it was in his best interest to head to South America. And so Jonathan Mann and I, we advised him on the best approach to leave Hong Kong. Now, just one thing I'd like to stress, under the non-penalization principle, under Article 33 of the UN Refugee Convention, an asylum seeker has a right to enter any jurisdiction, lawfully or unlawfully. So Ed Snowden had an option. I couldn't advise him to enter another location illegally, but under the UN Convention, he had a right to do that. So if Ed had not left by the airport through open channels, he could have still left or departed Hong Kong through unlawful or illegal channels. And then a refugee has a right to do that. So on the 23rd of June, 2013, I went to the airport with Ed, and Jonathan Mann was there. Jonathan had bought an airline ticket and had gone inside. He had a ticket to Shanghai, but he had only gone inside and bought the ticket to be at the boarding gate for Ed in case something happened. And at that time, there were a lot of plainclothes officers from the Hong Kong government. We think they were immigration officers standing at the boarding gate. So Sarah Harrison was with me, and Sarah Harrison went through immigration and customs, no problem, and Ed got on his flight. The difficulty Ed had in the end was his passport was revoked by the US government, and he got stuck in Moscow. Now, these clients who helped Mr. Snowden, they never betrayed Mr. Snowden. They kept their mouths shut. And it was in May 2015 that I discovered from Oliver Stone, when he was filming in Hong Kong, that he had completed filming of asylum seekers who assisted Mr. Snowden. And I did not know Oliver Stone knew that, and I didn't know this was going to be included in a Hollywood film. there was a third person who told Oliver Stone that was privy to this information. And at that point, I realized that once the film comes out, that it's not going to be a difficult process for governments and media to figure out which of my clients had assisted Mr. Snowden. And in June 2016, there were a dozen media at Vanessa, she's one of the asylum seekers who assisted Mr. Snowden, was at her house. I'll just stop here for a second. You can stand up. These are three of the adults. Three of the people who protected Mr. Snowden and sheltered him for a 2-week period. Vanessa Rodell from the Philippines, Ajit Pushpa from Sri Lanka, a former soldier, and Nadika, also from Sri Lanka. In my view, these people are heroes. Ed would not be able to be free today and to continue in his dialogue with the global community on privacy rights, government electronic mass surveillance, and government abuses. So I brought them here today so that everybody can actually meet them face to face and look into their eyes, as opposed to seeing them on television or seeing a photograph. These people have been treated in an inhumane and degrading manner by the Hong Kong government. And since September 2016, when the Snowden film came out, they've been targeted by the Hong Kong government, and they've been targeted by the Sri Lankan Police Criminal Investigation Department, who have harassed the families in Sri Lanka and who landed on the ground here in November and December last year, targeting them, hunting them down, if I can use that word. So you guys can sit down. Now I'm just going to jump to, I'm going to go back to what happened to Vanessa. So in July last year, she had a dozen media at her house banging on her door. Her daughter was in there, 4 years old at the time. So we couldn't figure out why they were at her door. So I went back and I thought, well, there are hundreds of people working on Oliver Stone's film. The data is on a hard drive. So either of the hundreds of people who worked on the film, they've seen this, they've leaked the information out, somebody's purchased it, or some government, one of the Five Eyes or another government, has taken a look at what's on the hard drive illegally. And after the film came out, the media were immediately back at Vanessa's door. So they knew who she was. So there was nothing we could do, nothing I could do to stop that. This was out of our control. The advice I gave to the clients is, look, the media is going to be hunting you down, and following the media will maybe other people. It's in your best interests to be exposed to the sunlight, to show who you are, your identities, show yourself as human beings. Not to try to hide in the shadows, because eventually you're going to be caught on the street, the media will catch you, somebody will stop you, and you'll be there without a lawyer. I thought about my other 50-odd clients whose doors were going to be banged on, and many of them suffer. They've suffered trauma and continue to suffer from that trauma in their own countries of persecution and torture. So the three clients made a decision that, yes, we'll talk to specific media. That was Handelsblatt of Germany, Zonka Iversen, who did an outstanding job introducing these families to the public, Teresa Tedesco of the National Post in Canada, and the New York Times did a story. Jane Russell was brought in as the exclusive photographer because I didn't want any more intrusion that was necessary into these families' lives. So what happened is, immediately after the film came out, all my cases for asylum seekers in Hong Kong had been held in limbo for years. But the Hong Kong government reactivated just their cases and said, okay, we're going to screen you immediately. And then the government reactivated another 23 cases shortly after that. So by early December, I couldn't manage the workload. And these were cases that started at different times over a 5-year period, 6-year period. So then I was able to file their claims on time before Christmas, and then the Hong Kong government wrote to the duty lawyer service and asked that I be removed from their cases. And they also asked that I be removed from all their cases. The duty lawyer service refused. Then we found out that the Sri Lankan police were on the ground in Hong Kong. We reported this to the immigration department in January 2017. Immigration did nothing. We went to the police. The police said the immigration department was investigating it. We got a letter from immigration saying that we should report this to the police. So we went to the media saying the government's not investigating this matter, they're not accepting the complaints, they're not providing what we call state protection. So then the immigration department, knowing I'd be in Europe a couple weeks ago, decided to screen these people, my clients, when I was not in Hong Kong. So I asked Rob Connolly and Peter Barnes to step in for me. It was legal representation, but it was not effective. So I came back early. I said I was available. The immigration department said, no, we don't need to screen them anymore. We'll just do it in writing. So clearly, my client, these families who helped Mr. Snowden had been targeted, singled out, and their claims to be screened on an expedited basis, but not to protect them, but to remove them. And that's at odds with the UN Committee Against Torture's recommendations for Hong Kong. Now, just so you know, the acceptance rate in Hong Kong, I mentioned this earlier, is effectively 0%. So my clients are expecting to have their cases rejected. So last September, I approached 3 colleagues from Montreal, 3 lawyers, and said, look, we need to get them out of Hong Kong. They're going to be sent back to their home country. They said, sure, we'll do it pro bono. They set up an NGO called For the Refugees, and in January this year, we filed formal refugee claims with the Canadian government. Those claims are now sitting in the Minister of Immigration, Ahmed Hussein's office, and we're waiting for him to make a decision. We'll be filing emergency visa applications. The Minister of Immigration has the discretion to issue visas to those persons who are in distressed, in immediate need, to bring them into Canada even before their refugee claims are decided. So we're at that point where we'll be making that application for emergency visas. We're aware that Prime Minister Trudeau has the files on his desk at this time. So we're asking the Canadian government to intervene because the Hong Kong government will not. The Hong Kong government is not acting in the best interests of these clients. Even if these clients succeeded in their asylum claims, they would not be allowed to resettle in Hong Kong. And there's simply a lack of state protection. Now, as for Ed, Ed's been extremely supportive of these clients. I've been in touch with him on a regular basis, and Ed's helped out by tweeting from time to time. He has 3 million plus followers on Twitter, so he's assisted in the wider wider advocacy for these clients. And Mr. Snowden would like to see these families brought into Canada at the soonest time as well. I'm going to leave this to Q&A at this time because there are a lot of questions about Mr. Snowden, and you may have questions about the families. So I'll leave it to Q&A at this point. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Robert Tibbo. Yes, we'll start with questions from the floor. Please identify yourself and with a show of hand, ask for the mic. The gentleman there, thank you.
Hi, my name's Ted Kavoris. I just want to clarify your position that if, as I thought you said, if Mr. Snowden was extradited to the U.S., he would face torture?
Absolutely.
How so? How would you justify that?
Chelsea Manning. Chelsea Manning was tortured. In his trial, in the end, he was given a 30-year sentence, and the trial judge said, we do admit we tortured you, so you get a 6-month reduction.
Good deal. I don't agree.
Check your facts. Chelsea Manning was a whistleblower. Chelsea Manning was a whistleblower. Snowden is the quintessential whistleblower. Would you like me to go through the principles of whistleblowing? Let me go through that quickly. Constitutional law says there's a right to freedom of expression. When an individual is deep down inside a government organization or a corporate entity, they have access to information that's most reliable. When that organization or institution or government is committing crimes or egregious conduct, there's a balancing exercise. That exercise is it in the public interest to disclose the criminal and egregious conduct? Or is it in the public interest to conceal that? What the US government did was horrendous. It was the quintessential surveillance state spying on everybody. So on balance, Mr. Snowden was absolutely right to express himself and to make those disclosures because these were clearly in the public interest. And even US government officials have said that as recently as this year, saying that, you know, Mr. Snowden did the right thing. He broke the law, but he, you know, we don't disagree with him. He did the right thing. Okay. For Mr. Snowden's case, he's been charged under the Espionage Act for 3 counts of theft. People think he's been charged with treason or espionage. That's not true. Just theft. Okay. But Mr. Snowden doesn't have a constitutional defense of freedom of expression that you would have in Hong Kong or you'd have in Canada or the UK. He's blocked from having that. So this is basically an absolute liability offense. Okay. In 2008, Martin Sheenan, and sir, I'm sure you read his report. He was the UN Special Rapporteur on human rights violations and counterterrorism activities of governments. Okay. And in that report, he sets out that what government needs to do is to have a whistleblower mechanism within the government, but that's separate from the organization or the institution the whistleblower is in. That was published in 2008 to the UN General Assembly. Obama ignored it. It was completely ignored. So the United States has to ask itself, why didn't they put in a proper whistleblower mechanism? And Snowden had seen what happened to other people who weren't even whistleblowers. You know, how they'd been arrested, their houses searched, and treated horrifically. Okay. So this is trite law, trite international legal principles. Okay. Julian Assange is not a whistleblower. Julian Assange is a publisher. He's a journalist. There's a difference between the two. But Chelsea Manning and Snowden are classic whistleblowers.
Thank you.
So next question.
Yeah, we'll take next question. And I'd like to confirm that on the general view of all the media in the world, Edward Snowden is definitely a whistleblower. Yes, this question, thank you.
Peter Bozar, retired correspondent. I have a broad question and a specific question. The broad question is, if I understood you correctly, you said you did this on a pro bono basis. People that I know who've tried to get pro bono legal assistance in Hong Kong have said that the rules in Hong Kong are highly restrictive in lawyers in terms of the amount and the nature of the work that you can do on a pro bono basis. I wonder if you can give a one-sentence outline on that. And since you just raised it, in the movie which I saw, Snowden noted that the UK is the most surveilled country in the world, more so than the US, China, or even Russia. And in that regard, it begs the question of why did he approach The Guardian, a UK newspaper, versus, say, the New York Times with his problem?
Okay, I'll answer the second question first. Ed's a super smart guy, really sharp. Ed was aware of the work that Glenn Greenwald had been doing, and you know, Glenn was focused on constitutional law, privacy rights. So Ed had focused on Glenn Greenwald, not The Guardian. And Laura Poitras had done some significant documentary film work. So Ed had, singled out Laura as well. So Ed's focus were on the journalists. And interestingly, both of them are Americans. So that's my answer to that second question. The first question, as far as I'm aware, there's no limit on the amount of pro bono work that counsel can do or a solicitor can do. So I'm really not aware on any limitation. Though I will stress that in the common law, it is a legal ethical obligation for lawyers to do a proportion of their work pro bono every year. And in my view, that seems to be lost on most lawyers in Hong Kong. At the same time, I'll say Hong Kong's an extremely difficult environment to work in and survive as a lawyer. Just the cost of living here makes it very difficult. And so the one thing I would stress is historically, if you look at some of the leading cases that have changed the legal system in terms of substantive law and procedure, they typically have been pro bono cases. For example, the law of negligence, pro bono case coming out of the UK. The role of the bar is to stand before your client and between a government that has massive resources, machinery, resources that the individual doesn't have, to create a level playing field. Government will abuse if they're not held accountable. So as a barrister, I realized from my legal education and starting off my practice that there's a war between government and civil society. And the front lines are where the vulnerable are standing, because the vulnerable are the ones who can be pushed around. They lack the education, the financial resources, the connections. So it's important that pro bono work be done, because these are the foundation cases that if not fought there, it'll be the middle class who'll be fighting those cases. It's a slippery, slidey slope. You have to identify where the battle lines are drawn. So.
Next question. So maybe Juliana, you from the BBC?
I covered this story in 2013 just as he was leaving, because I was on maternity leave before. I interviewed one of his other lawyers, Albert Ho, who told me that he reached out to Hong Kong officials on behalf of Mr. Snowden, your joint client. And there was a message, he believes, that was sent to Mr. Snowden by an unknown person. That person, according to Mr. Ho, essentially represented, he believed, the Beijing government, and essentially said that he should leave. Are you aware of that? And was there any message being sent from the Chinese government to your client?
All I can say is Ed wanted to exercise his option to depart from Hong Kong. And as lawyers, we were concerned that a formal request had been sent to the Hong Kong government. And that request would have required a number of things to happen. The Hong Kong government would have been duty-bound, no excuses, to apprehend Mr. Snowden, because at that point he would have been considered a fugitive, and Hong Kong would not want to breach its treaty with the US government. The second thing that would have happened was I would have had to explain to Mr. Snowden that, you can't stay with these families anymore, because these families would be committing a criminal offense. All I can say, I'm not going to go into the details, is that there were communications between those representing Mr. Snowden, or those with interests relating to Mr. Snowden, and the Hong Kong authorities. And there was an indication that it was still, Mr. Snowden could leave the territory. There was an indication that he could go. And I'm not going to say anything more than that. We also knew on the Saturday, on the 22nd of June, that there was a defect in the request by the US government, that they had misspelled his name. So, as a constitutional law, administrative law lawyer, I understood that the Hong Kong government wouldn't take a risk of arresting the wrong person. And then there was the issue of the Sami al-Sadi case. Al-Sadi didn't have refugee or asylum protection when he was renditioned through Hong Kong, unlawfully. But in this case, Snowden had full protections. So Mr. Snowden made his decision that yes, he would leave Hong Kong, and so I went with him to the airport, and we were all apprehensive that something could happen, things could suddenly change, and fortunately nothing did. Everything went very smoothly. One thing I'd like to share is that during these 2 weeks, I really didn't sleep. It's hard to explain doing a case of this magnitude with, a man's liberty, the fear that he could be apprehended, unlawfully rendition or extraordinarily rendition from Hong Kong. There's a lot of adrenaline running through my system, and we didn't stop for 2 weeks. The other thing is I didn't think what was going on. I just focused on Mr. Snowden as another client, as a human being. Even today, I just see Ed, as a human being. When I talk to other people, I mention Ed Snowden, their eyes light up. Everybody's eyes light up. But for myself as his lawyer, I just see him as a human being he is, and focusing on advising him and making sure he has the advice he needs to make the best decisions for himself.
Thank you. Since we have just a few minutes left and I have 2 questions, I see one from the floor. How shall we do? Maybe we put you all the questions and you try and cover them all?
Yeah.
Okay, so this sir, please.
Thank you. Very quick one. Was Mr. Snowden's U.S. passport revoked before he bought the plane or when he's on the plane? Thank you.
When he was on the plane, after he got on the plane.
Okay. Mine is why, in your understanding, would your clients be singled out currently by the Hong Kong government, as you seem to say? So I don't see the logic for this. And of course, we would also all like to hear some news of Ed Snowden today.
Okay. It's quite clear the Hong Kong government has... Hong Kong government's not democratically elected. And as we've seen in the last few years, the Hong Kong government just has a propensity to project its power. It doesn't listen to the wider civil society. It just does what it wants to do, and it gets away with it. And what's shocking is there's significant public support for the Hong Kong government acting in such an authoritative manner. So in my view, I think a reasonable inference can be made, even stronger than that, that the Security Bureau has an interest in my clients because they sheltered Mr. Snowden. So there's a security issue. And I believe that the executive branch in Beijing also have interests in my clients. So the first thing they did is through the Social Welfare Department and International Social Services Hong Kong, they asked Vanessa, and they asked Nadika and her partner Sapun questions about Mr. Snowden. So this was in September and October last year. So it was the first thing they did. My clients went in to explain that they're destitute, they're hungry, they don't have enough food, they can't pay their rent or electricity. But ISS and the Social Welfare Department, all they wanted to know was about Mr. Snowden. So I think it's just simply a security matter, a security interest. Secondly, I think the Hong Kong government wants my clients out of Hong Kong. With a 0% acceptance rate, it's quite clear the Hong Kong government has treated my clients in an inhumane and degrading way. They want them out. And it's clear the way they've treated asylum seekers in Hong Kong historically that they really don't care how they're affected. Hong Kong government does nothing concerning family reunification. They've done nothing to allow asylum seekers to settle in Hong Kong. And when asylum seekers are rejected and sent back to their home countries, Hong Kong has an obligation to track those individuals and monitor their welfare when they return to their home countries. Hong Kong government doesn't do that, and there's no data on that. This is a government that's recalcitrant when it comes to the rights of asylum seekers.
Can you just give us some the latest news of Edward Snowden, and then we really need to wrap up. Thank you.
Okay. Ed's doing fine. There's been some nonsense about NBC News reporting that, Putin was going to hand him over as a gift to Donald Trump, which was nonsense. I'm unaware of that. Ben Wisner's unaware of that. Kucherin is unaware of that. And Putin's own spokesman said they're unaware of that. And Ed was just given another 3-year business visa, so he can stay in Russia for the next 3 years. The other issue is the extraordinary Edward Epstein, who wrote his book accusing Mr. Snowden of being a spy, saying things such as Tipping Chen of the Wall Street Journal went to the Mirror Hotel and said Snowden only checked in on the 1st of June and left on the 10th. Where was he for 20 days? Well, after 2 years of work, I got the hotel records. I gave them to Glenn Greenwald and Charlie Savage of the New York Times, and pointed out that I told Edward Epstein in 2014, before he wrote his first Wall Street Journal article and his recent book, and with all the fanfare that went with that Mr. Snowden was staying at 2 hotels from the 20th of May onward. And that's something that Edward Epstein chose not to believe. So now that ridiculous journalism has been knocked back. Ed's doing fine. He's working with the Freedom of the Press Foundation. The other directors of the Freedom of the Press Foundation are Trevor Tim, Laura Poitras, Glenn Greenwald, and the Hollywood actor John Cusack. As well, Ed's active in speaking engagements in different conferences and different academic institutions globally.
Okay, well, thank you very much, and please pass him our invitation to speak to us by Skype or any safe mean. And with this, we should thank you very much, Robert Tibbo, for sharing with us all this information.
Thank you.